Good evening, everyone. Am I on? Can you hear me? We always say at FOLCS, give us an hour and you'll leave much smarter. But today, at the end of an hour, you still have some time to make it home for the Oscars. So I'm not sure if that'll make you smarter, but at least you'll have 2 hours of additional time to digest what we have to say. Before I introduce my friends who will be talking tonight, I think there's a lot of confusion about free speech, and that's what we're really here to discuss. We're told that the United States has always had the most permissive free speech laws, and in fact, that's always been true. Europe would never allow neo-Nazis to march on a town of Holocaust survivors or burning crosses on African-American lawns, burning flags in front of families that had children serving in the military, breaking up military funerals because you're opposed to gays serving in the military. This is all Supreme Court precedent, very permissive laws. And in terms of the Supreme Court precedents, there's nothing like the Dobbs decision that has overturned Roe v. Wade. Nothing has happened. The culture has changed. The legal system has stayed exactly the same. And this is something that Nadine and I spar about all the time, and I'm sure we'll do it again tonight. But the law is there if you think that you want to restrict speech in some ways, but we don't. Liberals and conservatives on the Supreme Court have always been consistent. More free speech, the better. 100 years ago, a Supreme Court justice said, essentially, the marketplace of ideas. You have a marketplace of ideas, good ideas cancel out the bad ideas. There was another Supreme Court justice who said, speech is like a disinfectant. It's like sunlight. The more you get, the more the public discourse is. This is what we've been told, yet we now have cancellations and self-censorship. We have newspapers and cable news stations telling us what to think dogmatically with their own agendas. What does that sound? Okay. So these things are confusing. They result in these free speech confusions. So we're going to try to unpack that, as we say, and with the perfect all-star panel for this. First, far end, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist in the New York Times, Bret Stephens. True icon of the First Amendment, Floyd Abrams, argued dozen cases before the Supreme Court. Represented the New York Times 30 years, more? 40 years? How long have you represented the New York Times?
Not anymore.
Not anymore, but for decades.
A long time.
For a long time. And if you notice PBS, the last American Masters series, it's usually about artists, was on Floyd Abrams. That's almost never happened as far as I know. So you watch that. And then the last guest is I would call the First Lady of the First Amendment, Nadine Strossen, who for many years was the president of the ACLU. She's written books on First Amendment and free speech. She's a professor at New York Law School. I should tell you before we start, 4 years ago, right around now, the world nearly shut down. We were a week away from shutting down. On the 17th of March, I had a book on free speech that was being published, and that whole book tour was canceled. We were supposed to be here in April on this stage 4 years ago, all 4 of us. That was canceled, but we did it virtually. My friends showed up. We showed up for the Y. This might have been one of the first events the Y hosted virtually. We didn't even know what Zoom was at that time. And so I will admit, if you watch that, the 3 of them ganged up on me. It was like a bloodbath, but it was fun. So anyway, welcome back. It was the Y's idea that we should bring back the same group that got canceled for a different reason. We're going to show, we're going to do this by way of anecdotes, things that are in the public sphere that you know and that you might have had confusion about. How does this play out in the First Amendment? Why are there these kinds of speech restriction codes on campus? Where did this come from, that there's been all this restriction on speech? Let's start with the first one. Andres? All right, well, everyone knows what that photo is. That's the photo of Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. you may know, he had been, I think, he was a major player in the NFL, and soon was kicked out of the NFL. There were people complaining about this. Now, I want to start with Nadine and Floyd. What's interesting is everyone said, well, doesn't he have a right to a political opinion? He's biracial, he's opposed to police brutality, he's in favor of racial justice. Why can't he do that? Isn't the First Amendment protect him? And the answer to that is what?
The answer to that, Thane, as many people do not know, the First Amendment only binds the government. Only the government has a responsibility to protect free speech for controversial political opinions. A private sector employer not only has no First Amendment obligation to protect free speech rights of employees, such as Colin Kaepernick, a private sector employer, to the contrary, has its own free speech rights to choose what message to purvey and what not to purvey.
And if an employer says, we want you standing at attention with your helmet off for the playing of the national anthem, or we want you wearing a suit, whatever it is, and this is not just for the NFL, it's all employers, that employers are different unless they are the government. So for instance, I always use this example. If the state of California had passed a law that said at all sporting events throughout the state, when the national anthem is played, everyone must take their hat off or their helmet, whatever it is, people in the stand on the field, and pay attention and give respect. That would be a First Amendment violation, right, Floyd? I mean, that's just
absolutely
right. And so and I was actually thinking about how, for those of you of a certain age, in 1968 in the Olympics in Tokyo, when Juan Carlos, Mexico City, right? Thank you. Juan Carlos, he's from Mexico City, so he takes it very seriously. He was born there. Not born there. But raised there. When they raised their fist during the playing of the national anthem, interestingly, the United States did not take any actions against them. It was the International Olympic Committee that sent them home, like punished them. You have to go home. And they were giving, the sign for Black Power. But that was, again, a different entity. It wasn't the United States government. It was a separate entity. Okay, so let's move on. Andres, let's move on to a second. Now, what's interesting about that other thing is that, and we'll come to it in a second, is that Colin Kaepernick was essentially canceled. His career was over. The public at that time complained to the NFL and the San Francisco 49ers. He ended up being jobless, even though he could have easily made the team, some other team, even as a backup. No one wanted him. He was truly canceled for expressing a political opinion, but a political opinion in the private sector where football fans did not like the fact that he wasn't standing at attention. So he was canceled, and yet it wasn't a free speech issue per se. Let's look at item number 2. Yes. 2 people for whom this is very interesting. You may remember, this is the New York Times op-ed by Tom Cotton 3 summers ago. So I guess if this was, there it is. It's in June. This was in the aftermath of some of the Black Lives Matter rallies, those offshoots that ended up resulting in violence. Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas wrote an op-ed that obviously the New York Times accepted. And in it, he said, I think that in order to deal with the violence that is the offshoots of Black Lives Matter, we should invoke the insurrection clause, where the National Guard is called out to assist the local police. Remember, if you're defunding the police was standing down, nobody was doing anything, so Cotton had this idea. And that resulted in, I don't know, Floyd, Bret, maybe you can start. What actually happened? Because one thing you know for sure, the person who hired Bret Stephens, who had a Pulitzer Prize at the time, Bret did, the guy who hired him was fired. He's no longer at the New York Times. For publishing a United States senator's opinion on what to do about the violence in the connection. If you are reading Barry Weiss, I know she spoke here a week ago. If not for that, she'd probably still be at the New York Times. It was a bloodletting of everyone who was there, except for Bret. He's the only one who actually survives that. So Bret, tell the audience, tell us about that.
Well, I mean, I'll be candid because after my former boss, James Bennett, was, just to be precise, his resignation was demanded and accepted. So I guess that's not firing. I wrote a column in the Times calling it, I think, one of the worst decisions I'd ever seen by the paper. For many reasons. And again, the New York Times has an absolute right to publish or not publish whom it pleases. I mean, we are gatekeepers for what we think is acceptable opinion. But we were looking for a contrary opinion, and Senator Cotton spoke for, I think at the time, 57% of the American public, at least according to some polls. So the idea that as a newspaper that had published Vladimir Putin, the head of the Haqqani network, or deputy head, Muammar Gaddafi, that we should not publish Tom Cotton struck me as, I'm being diplomatic, insane. And I said so in the paper. You can find my column from a couple of days later. Not because I agreed with the argument, but because I think we had a responsibility as a paper to air all shades of opinion, and for our audience, particularly given that our audience leans maybe a little bit to the left, to be exposed to the full argument, whether they agreed with it or not. Most likely they wouldn't agree, that a majority of Americans felt spoke for them.
But what was interesting about that, and I want maybe the two of you to speak about this, is that the reason the New York Times ended up, I guess they gave an apology, they disavowed it, they claimed that it wasn't fact-checked. It was so insane. I mean, they were literally tripping over themselves to try to explain why they were so apologetic about publishing this. My understanding was the reason they were forced to act is because of the people who worked at the Times, your colleagues.
Yeah, there was tremendous pressure from inside the building. And I'm not in the business of maligning my employer because I want to have a column this week.
No, but I'm just saying, but what was interesting, the cancellation there came internally.
Well, what happened was essentially there was a newsroom revolt accelerated by the forces of social media, where you could retweet certain statements that had been carefully written to present themselves as safety issues, workplace safety issues. And there was tremendous pressure within the building, claims that the editorial, the opinion essay by Senator Cotton put the lives of Black New York Times staff members in danger. And that created this, I mean, as I saw it, a kind of an uprising in the paper that was
now that word
resulted in James Bennett's
The word
dismissal.
endangerment is important because that comes up a lot. And if you pay attention, you'll see with universities, it's always the word that's used. We don't want the speaker because it endangers people who are on campus.
Or harms.
Or harms. Harms or endangerment. It comes up all the time.
It's especially troubling, and it was for me at the time, that it was journalists.
Right.
Who were journalists, who were proud as a social class to withstand pressures, dangers, and the like.
You represented the New York Times and the Pentagon Papers, the same case, right?
Right, and so I don't mean every person there who objected was a journalist, but they were staff up and down the Times, and I found it especially offensive that a journalistic organization would be so overthrown, as it were, at least in its initial editorial judgment, on the ground, of all grounds, that journalists wouldn't feel safe.
But Floyd, if I may say so, belonging to another profession that historically and traditionally has been particularly committed to First Amendment free speech values, academia, we have been seeing the same phenomenon there. where students and even faculty members are making the exact same complaints that an idea that they find that they disagree with somehow is causing harm and endangering
Now,
them.
did anyone
You know,
consider?
this is a pet theory of mine, which is every profession ends up attracting exactly the people who shouldn't be in that profession. So politics, which is supposedly public service, attracts malevolent narcissists. Psychotherapy attracts crazy neurotics. Like academia attracts ideologues, and you go down the list.
Did anyone?
And unfortunately, journalism too often, I would add, ends up attracting people who think they're in the social activism profession, not in the get the facts and tell them profession.
Well, right, and I want to get to that. Thank you. Because it implicates two elements of the First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of the press, right? I mean, it was a failure on both constitutional principles. A large number of the people that worked in the New York Times forgot what a newspaper does or rejected it. They simply said, this idea is beyond the pale, and we cannot work at a place that would publish such a thing. And I think, I'm not crediting the New York Times with this, but we're seeing this in all journalism, broadcast journalism, you know, this balkanized lack of diversity of viewpoints where we're not really learning the news.
Well, and let's not forget social media, which, worse yet, you have a lot of pressure from government officials pressuring the companies to deplatform speakers or perspectives that are critical of or inconsistent with favored government policies.
And you end up with an incredible amount of self-censorship, the very thing that you're supposed to do. First of all, I remember, I think about this Tom Cotton thing all the time. Like, I wonder, you can't answer this, did the Times consider firing everybody? Just saying, look, we made a mistake, you made a mistake, I don't think you understand what happens at a newspaper. This is the New York Times, it's the paper of record. We will definitely find other people. You're not the only ones. And you just don't seem to get, it's okay, nothing personal. You don't seem to understand what we do at a newspaper. So don't come to pick up your things. You don't belong here, go. And what we saw instead, we saw this with corporations around America. It wasn't executives. It was always the kids at Disney. It's the guy in the Goofy costume at Disney is the guy that ended up with all the power. And I think that that's something that when we talk about the cancel culture, remember, this is a cancellation ethos that originates in colleges. And there were people like me who totally misjudged it. I always traveled around the world and people would ask me and I go, oh, it's just a bunch of silly college kids. It had never occurred to me that this kind of thinking, this kind of need for self-protection, this safe spaces, would actually bleed into the private sector. It never occurred to us.
And one of the professions that has been affected, I'm curious to hear how Bret would analyze who goes into this profession, is the legal profession, where it did take a while for law schools to be witness to the kinds of deplatformings and cancellations that were marring undergraduate institutions. I remember when Heather Gerken became dean of Yale Law School in the summer of 2018, she wrote a very proud op-ed and said, you know, there have been incidents on undergraduate campuses, including Yale, but it will never happen at a law school because our culture is the adversary system and to debate different perspectives on every issue. And we also have a culture of professional courtesy where lawyers respect each other despite different views. And how long did it take before we started seeing very disturbing instances of discourtesy and deplatforming?
I'm going to show you a clip soon. Yes, I mean, we're going to talk about that very thing.
But, you know, Nadine brings up an important point here, which is that the issue here isn't principles. You know, I love the Groucho Marx quote, "These are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others." And that was more or less the stand that I saw one institutional leader after another take in the wake of this wave of social pressure. What these leaders had never been taught, if it's teachable, is something called courage. And I'm not going to I won't go back to the Cotton piece, but I always thought there was a lot to be said for what Ronald Reagan did when the air traffic controllers went on strike. He fired them all, you know, because there was a principle at stake, and he was able to do it. This probably doesn't go down well with everyone. Someone here probably has an angry memory about it. But that showed that he was willing to be in command of his government. And you have deans and university presidents and leaders of media organizations that are not really in command of their institutions because they think that leadership is a popularity contest. Leadership is the opposite of a popularity contest. It's particularly about willing to hew to principles when they are unpopular.
But the difference is that, and we'll talk about this soon, believe me, we're going to talk about the 3 university presidents' congressional testimony, is that they live in fear of the staff or students, the humanities students. Who knew people taking gender studies and queer studies and indigenous literature run the table in universities? They're terrified of the humanities faculty and the humanities. Larry Summers, who's been a guest of ours twice, Larry Summers lost his job. The law school was behind him, the business school was behind him, the medical school. He lost his job because of the humanities department. So I think we should remember, I always think about it, it seems like the kids are running the show. And let me just make one last comment about the Insurrection Act. There's an irony. Many of you may remember, in the 1960s, it was the Insurrection Act that was used to desegregate schools in the Deep South. Remember military, was it Little Rock, Arkansas, elementary schools, high schools, University of Mississippi, University of Alabama. African-American kids were being escorted into the buildings under the Insurrection Act. So it just seemed like a soiling of the memory to say that the Insurrection Act is a racist act.
No, but the Insurrection Act, as applied by a senator who was no friend of New York City, the Insurrection Act bring in troops from outside New York to solve our problem.
But Kathy Hochul just said the same thing.
Well, I mean, I think it's important not to lose the sense, the correct sense. Tom Cotton is no friend of New York. He didn't mean well by us, and I think that's my view. Whether or not that's correct, it is correct to say that he had never before written something saying we must protect New Yorkers.
Okay. Although I do want to say, Nadine and I talked about this backstage, it is interesting that Kathy Hochul, that people cheered her just a week ago when she said we've got problems in the subway system and we're going to...
And actually
Well,
brought
hang
in
on a
the
second.
National
What happened
Guard.
on January 6th?
Right.
People rightly said, call in the troops.
Yeah.
It just depends on who's doing the insurrecting that
Right.
animates your feelings.
Let's talk about let's show you something. I have to set this up. Oh, you know what I didn't do? Oh, God, forgot. If you're taking CLE credit, here's your code for number 1. It's like a bingo game. Your code was TLC 428. That says that you're taking the course. And at the end of the night, I'll try to remember to give you code 2 that says you completed the course. And it's like a lotto game. So here it is again, TLC 428. That's your number. So let's talk a little about universities. This requires a little setup. A federal judge in Texas who was known for, among other things, as a private attorney representing an organization that challenged transgender bathrooms. He was known for that. He ended up becoming appointed to the Fifth Circuit, major position by Donald Trump appointed him. And at Stanford Law School, the Federalist Society, which is the conservative division, right?
And libertarian.
And libertarian of all, they exist in pretty much every law school, the Federalist Society. Not surprisingly, they called him and said, would you come all the way to Stanford? I think he's in Texas, in Dallas. He went all the way from Texas all the way to Stanford. And this is what happened.
Associate Dean, what would you like to say? The room will talk to you.
Okay, because you are
This is
also
not your
talking
court.
to the room.
You asked for an administrator. She is an administrator.
You just asked for an administrator in
Do
here.
you want to do a chamber, or do you want someone to
No,
take care of you? You might handle and
Can I say okay? Is that okay?
So you've invited me to speak here, and I'm being heckled nonstop. And I'm just asking for an administrator to sign the
That's an
This is everyone walking out, pretty much everybody. And then this is my favorite part.
I want to ask that half the folks walk out and protest, and the rest of us, let's tone down the heckling slightly so we can get to our questions, which we so very much want to hear the responses.
Did you hear that? That line, tone down the heckling slightly. She didn't say stop heckling. She said just tone it down because we really want you to also hammer him with questions. This actually happened, in my view, worse at Yale, which is where you went to law school, Floyd. It was a worse incident that happened there. That was actually a free speech conference at which the students went nuts and the police were called in. This is Yale and Stanford, right? Wow. And given what Nadine said, what does that make you think when you see this?
Well, I fear for the rule of law and the legal profession and the intolerance of ideas that are disagreed with is really pervading law schools in a profound way, not just these deplatforming incidents, but we're seeing more and more situations where students are refusing to participate in moot court exercises where they disagree with the position that they're being asked to advocate, where students are demanding that they not be exposed to controversial cases that have holdings and language that are disturbing, including Plessy versus Ferguson, upholding so-called separate but equal, Dred Scott, of course, upholding enslavement of human beings.
And that's framed not in terms of endangerment, but it's harm, right? That's you causing trauma.
Exactly. And actually, quite a few years ago, Jeannie Suk Gerson, who's a professor at Harvard Law School, wrote a piece in the New Yorker talking about how already there was a lot of pressure at Harvard and many other law schools not to teach the law of rape because students saw that as creating trauma for anybody who had been subject to or feared being subject to sexual violence. So ultimately, what is at stake is not only freedom of speech and academic freedom, important as those are. What is really at stake is training the next generation of lawyers to defend all freedoms and all rights and interests for everybody in this country, not to mention the fact that lawyers so disproportionately become politicians and government officials and, not surprisingly, are going to be ill-equipped to participate in the kinds of debates and discussions and negotiations that we would hope would be a constructive part of the government process.
And again, one second, Floyd. And again, in a country that believes in free speech, right? So that's what I'm saying. That's the confusion. The law hasn't changed, but what happened with the student groups changed. The law protects this judge to speak, and should in a university should be welcome. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, it's true in high schools too. I mean, Huck Finn has become a work of such controversy that school boards around the country have to and have had to.
And that's because of the N-word.
Yes, the N-word of the hero of the book.
Right.
By the way, but yeah, I mean, one can understand how this happens, and that there is a sensitivity issue which is genuine and not at least deliberately aimed at free speech and free expression. But that's what the result is. That's where we wind up. Where the answer is, how do you think they would answer it? There are other books. We don't have to do Huck Finn.
Other principles.
We don't have to do this. We don't have to do that.
Right.
And to that degree, it's a major loss for our young people as students.
But what's ironic is that the verbiage of harm that we've been talking about it mostly in the context of progressive journalists and students and faculty members saying they feel harmed by Tom Cotton's ideas or by a racist epithet in Huck Finn. That exact same language and concept has been adopted by conservative Republican lawmakers in many states to outlaw curricula and library books that deal with critical race studies, other discussions of race and gender that they say are harmful and divisive.
I mean, look at Florida, look at Texas.
But
I mean, this is happening again and again.
So the marketplace of ideas shut down, right? To the extent that Oliver Wendell Holmes meant this is a full-time marketplace and it's always available 24/7, it's not.
And by the way, and there it is the state, and therefore, at least there has been able to be litigation about it, because the First Amendment does come into play.
The American Enterprise Institute conducted a poll of college students. Are you ready for this? 60% of those asked said that it's totally appropriate to shout down speakers with whom you disagree. 60%. That's why so many of them were in the room.
But you know, the problem, I've discovered this because I've now had 2 of my 3 kids apply to colleges, and it's interesting to see the kind of questions they're asked to answer. And all of the questions are, well, the emphasis is on your identity, your trauma, your victimization, right? I mean, any of you who have children and recently have gone through this, you've seen these questions. And so these schools are selecting for people for whom identity is more important than character, for whom victimization is a form of virtue. And everything in the pedagogy of many of these schools emphasizes and valorizes that. I mean, you know, it would be quite something if we had colleges that actually, say, ask students, tell us about a time you changed your mind and why, right? Or tell us about an opinion with which you disagree, but try to explain why that opinion might nonetheless be valid, despite the disagreement. You would be selecting very different kinds of students to enter into these elite, or what used to be called elite universities. I won't describe what happened there as evidence of elite.
We cut out 4 minutes of that. What I should have told you is the administrator who was there. She gave a 4 minutes rehearsed speech. She gave the speech. She's the head of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Department. I don't think she was even a lawyer, but she was in charge as administrator. He was trying to say, I'm asking for an administrator to quiet things down. The students were screaming, but she is an administrator. Yeah, but she was an administrator who came with her own agenda. And she ended up lecturing the judge about how much pain he caused in the room. And then she had this great line, is the juice worth the squeeze? Right, it's to say, why are you here? Given how much harm you're going to cause, why are you here? And he's looking at her like, you flew me here. You invited, why are you talking to me like that? Why am I here? She was literally saying, you should just go now, because now that we've made it clear that you should have never gotten on the plane to begin with. I want to
Stanford did. I think you might have added the president of Stanford.
Yes, apologized
and rejected.
Yes.
Yeah, but they didn't expel the students.
No.
I mean, the dean wrote a very angry letter, and I think put them through a day of training. But if it were up to me, I would have looked at every one of those students and said, "Good luck at UC
Harvard,
whatever."
Yeah. I want to just do one memory lane thing with Bret. We were on this stage, must have been 10, 15 years ago, I can't remember. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the human rights activist on behalf of women under Islam, was being given an honorary degree and a commencement speech at Brandeis University, and the students complained because she was critical of the Quran and the misogyny that Islamists impose against women, she was considered, she herself is Muslim, you know, and so she's a human rights activist, for God's sakes. But the Brandeis students rejected her, right? And so we invited her here, FOLCS and the 92nd Street Y. 6 months later, we invited her, and she received, you remember this, Bret, a 20-minute standing ovation. And it was a real New York rallying call that we understand that this is wrong. We're embarrassed that Brandeis did this. And I remember, Bret, we were standing off to the side. It was just extraordinary. We always used to say it was one of the best things we've ever done. So anyway, that's tooting our own horn. But it's true. There is this sense. Oh, I forgot the other statistic before we move on. 18%, are you ready for this, of students said that it's appropriate to resort to violence to stop a speaker that's saying something with which...
I can tell you a more recent survey that was conducted by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and College Pulse, which came out in September of 2023, 27% of students. This is the most comprehensive survey that's ever been done. It was of 248 campuses. We now famously know that Harvard ranked number 248. But one of the statistics across all of those students was 27% said it is at least sometimes appropriate to resort to violence to stop somebody from saying something that you consider offensive.
By the way, I would add, just for the sake of the political side of this discussion, if Trump, God forbid in my view, but if Trump is elected again in November, the video that you just saw at Stanford will explain some percentage of that vote. And if we lose our democracy, not just to the forces of extremism on the right, but also to those on the left, it will be because we have educated a generation of totalitarians. I mean, what you're seeing there is what Hannah Arendt saw in Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s.
And the distrust of college and universities has decreased, or the distrust has increased, and the disrespect has increased strongly among Democrats as well as Republicans.
So,
Bret.
Speaking of college, the next topic, and I don't want to show the clips because you don't need a clip. The 3 presidents that testified in front of Congress in connection with the anti-Semitism expressed on university campuses around the country. They all use the same word. Now remember, 2 of them are fired, but they use the word context. The question was repeatedly asked, does calling for the killing of Jews violate your code of conduct? I mean, at least Stefanik, the congresswoman, was very well prepared. I can't believe how badly prepared. They paid for a lot of legal fees, and they were so poorly prepared, the 3 college presidents. They didn't frame, Stefanik didn't say, and I'm curious about what you both would say, she didn't say, would it violate the First Amendment? She just simply said, would calling for the genocide of Jews violate your code of conduct? And the answer to that is yes, your student code of conduct. But I wondered, when that happened, I wondered, oh, my buddies, my sparring partners, Nadine and Floyd, they might have said, well, under Supreme Court precedent, this is not untrue, that context matters. So that if you can allow neo-Nazis to march on a town of Holocaust survivors, maybe you can allow someone to scream intifada in some generalized way, or from the river to the sea. If you allow someone to burn a cross on an African American's home, why can't you scream intifada? So I thought that Stefanik was prepared. She didn't say First Amendment. She said a code of conduct, and they were squirming for a few reasons. One, they were afraid if they said the wrong thing, they would be, killed the next day on campus. And I think that they were trying to say, well, there are First Amendment implications.
And there are. Look, I had 2 reactions, if I may. One, I was asked the next day if I would join a letter to the Times of First Amendment attorneys supporting the college presidents. And I said no. And the first reason for no was that the first line of their answer, whatever the the literal answer was going to be, had to be, what a disgraceful, appalling, racist thing, etc.
Mortified.
But there was none of that. And the answers, in fact, as you rightly say, were all, in fact, the first two, literally, it depends upon the context, which you know came from a lawyer. Only lawyers could come up with that.
And they thought they were answering correctly.
Yeah, yes. And the thought that I've had ever since is this, even in terms of the First Amendment, it seems to me, and the president of Yale 2 weeks later said something like that, if the language, and the word was genocide of all Jews, that was the question. You know, the advocacy of genocide of all Jews seems to me necessarily includes genocide of your fellow students,
right,
who are Jews. And therefore, it must violate a fair reading of whatever internal standards.
But beyond
they
that,
had.
Floyd, this is something that you and I go back and forth. It drives me nuts with you. But this is one thing that you sort of agree with me. There is the fighting words doctrine, and there is the true threats doctrine, and there is incitement, that there are prescribed categories where the Supreme Court has said, yeah, but not so far. There's an unlimited right to free speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater.
Falsely.
Falsely, right? And it can't be an empty theater. It has to be crowded.
Lawyers,
Right. Falsely. But there are categories, even that's under Supreme Court. So I'm saying, if you're screaming intifada into the face of Jews, I think that does invoke the fighting words doctrine. It does invoke true threats, and it shouldn't receive First Amendment protection.
And a number of these campuses now have been subject to private lawsuits and also to investigations and complaints by the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education for creating and tolerating hostile environment harassment and intimidation and bullying and threats against Jews and also against Muslims on some campuses. And so I think although the answer was technically correct as far as it went, it really did not go far enough because it did not acknowledge the many, many situations that have been well documented on these campuses of speech that in context did present what Louis Brandeis, the great first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court, called the emergency principle, when speech in the particular facts and circumstances directly causes or threatens certain specific harm when it's targeted at particular individuals, going beyond dislike of the idea that's purveyed, then it should be punished. And I told you, Thane, that my thinking really crystallized in a new way after October 7th as a longtime advocate of free speech. I really came to appreciate that if we are to truly enjoy a free speech culture beyond the legal technicality of a free speech right, as we've been discussing, it is very important not only that constitutionally protected speech not be punished, but it's also important that constitutionally unprotected speech should be punished, including, as Bret says, by disciplining the students, because they are violating other people's free speech rights, and worse than that, they're intimidating and interfering with the sense of safety and the actual physical safety.
But also Title VI.
Can I just say, though, that, I mean, what the university presidents did, what's the line? It was worse than a crime, it was a mistake. I mean, the ineptitude, as Floyd put it, the failure to summon a sense of indignation before answering the question was the reason they deserved to be fired. But what the president said was not wrong, okay? I mean, if someone screams intifada in my face, I'm going to ask, well, do you mean the first intifada or the second intifada, right? There's a difference. There's an important, no, and I say this as someone whose views are well known, okay? I think there's an important distinction, right? If you mean a second intifada, you want to blow me up in a bus, I have a problem with that. First intifada, you want to scream in my face, that's fine. The problem they had, and the reason they had to be fired, was that these same people who had enforced essentially a hate speech doctrine against offenses when they hurt other minority groups, suddenly discovered their free speech principles when it came to the Jews. So my view is free speech is a wonderful standard, but it is a terrible double standard. And what you had with those presidents, especially with the president of Harvard, who had been a dean and who had overseen the dismissal of various faculty members for offenses in a woker direction, suddenly became a libertarian when the question was the genocide of the Jews.
I mean, surely, if it were genocide of blacks, genocides of pick 'em. I mean,
Or just say lynch
pick any
blacks.
group
Lynch
other
blacks.
than Jews, I think. We
Yeah.
would have had a very different sort of
Well,
reaction.
and one of the points that was made less visibly, but another member of Congress noted that a member of the Harvard faculty lost her job, or essentially was pushed out of her job, Carol Hooven, because she believes that sex is binary, right? And for that, she was pushed out of Harvard. But someone calling for the genocide of Jews, then it depends on the
political opinion,
context.
it's context.
So that was the problem there.
Let's show another video that speaks to this idea, what Nadine said about October 7th. This needs no introduction.
On February 26th, hundreds of pro-Palestinian protesters broke down the door of UC Berkeley's Zellerbach Playhouse, where an Israeli speaker was set to address Jewish students. The demonstration appears to have been organized by a student group, Bears for Palestine. In a Facebook post the day before, the group called on people to protest the event, which was sponsored by 3 Jewish organizations.
All right, that was another different version of shouting down. That was actual violence. You may not know that those students that were attending the lecture were taken underneath a tunnel. I'm sorry, it's tunnel again, but there was a tunnel underneath that building to rescue them. There's a part in the clip where a Jewish girl says, "What is this, Berlin, 1935?" That's her line. And it is sort of appalling, and it goes to the point that
It's 38, actually.
Right, 38, right. Well, that's true. The reason I'm thinking 36 is because the Juan Carlos thing actually has a connection to the 1936 Olympics. Anyway, so this is what it looks like writ large, and also the social media element. You saw the poster. That was an Instagram post that essentially gathered this crowd, and in the legal system, there's actually Supreme Court precedent. There's people that think that they have the right to what's called the heckler's veto, and under Supreme Court, you don't.
Unfortunately, this is a pattern that we've seen constantly, including once again last week, I believe it was at Berkeley, some university in California, where again it was an Israeli professor who was going to be speaking about math or physics, something in the STEM area, but because he had been in the IDF, he was accused of genocide, and the security forces refused to protect the speaker and the willing audience members who also have First Amendment free speech rights, wrongly saying, oh, but the protesters have their free speech rights and we have to protect them. And there is so much ignorance that I see over and over and over again.
Heckling is your right to speak.
You
when in
have a
fact,
right to non-disruptive...
Is this Feiner versus New York or something?
Yes,
Yeah,
you have a right to non-disruptive protest, but if you disrupt, and certainly if you engage in violence or threaten violence, you are undermining violating the free speech rights of others.
And here's something else that's going to come up. You're going to see more of it because there's lawsuits and investigations with the Department of Education. These universities are going to be stripped of federal funding. This violates Title VI. You can't, what Nadine just said, forget the First Amendment. You can't mess with a person's right to learn on campus. You can't, what happened at Harvard apparently this semester, that at the main library where people were studying for exams, there was this huge banner that was everywhere around, and there were students holding a banner about Israel being genocide, apartheid. And so you couldn't have studied in that room. If you were Jewish, you'd be looking everywhere. And this idea that the campus can be hijacked and you can break down windows, these are Title VI violations. And in theory, you're seeing more and more of this being brought. Harvard's going to get hammered. I mean, at the end of this, they're literally the worst.
Do you think Harvard's going to lose a Title VI case?
Yeah, I do. But I'm talking to a pro. So I can't, look, let me just say, Harvard, there was a joint conference by University of North Carolina and Duke a few years ago that was supposed to be about the Middle East. And not one speaker had anything to say about Israel in a favorable way. It was 2 days of hammering Israel.
That would be constitutionally protected, by the way, but the standard under Title VI, which is usually referred to as hostile environment harassment,
Right.
is if there is a pattern of conduct, which can include expressive conduct, that is so severe and pervasive and objectively offensive that it effectively deprives the targeted students or groups of equal educational opportunities. That violates Title VI.
Which is the idea of stopping people from going into a library or into a lecture. Why, Floyd, why do you think that, why do you seem dubious that Harvard would lose that case?
I just think it's a tough case to make the centerpiece of responding to student misconduct and faculty and supposed university controllers of the contest.
I actually read the Harvard complaint. I think it was about 88 pages long with hundreds of factual allegations. And I have to tell you, I'm pretty thick-skinned.
Yeah.
If even 10% of those allegations were factually correct, I really think that the legal standard would be satisfied.
On a panel shouldn't offer a casual opinion.
Well, also, I didn't want to say anything, Floyd, but I'm part of the lawsuit against Berkeley. I'm defendant number 14 out of 16 defendants, I think. So I'm already in that lawsuit, and it's the same idea. It's all Title VI about the pervasive. Can I just read something to you guys? I hope this doesn't freak you out. Now, here's the idea of academic freedom, right? Professors say, I have the right to say what I want. I have tenure, and so that's what academic, and we have an academic here as well. So this is a Arab-American doctor at the University of California in San Francisco, and this just came out last week. These are her tweets. She's a doctor. She's on the faculty at this medical school. Zionist doctors may be harming patients and should be investigated. The presence of Zionists in the U.S. medicine system causes structural impediments to health equity. So I don't know how people feel about that. That's a way that is off campus. She's not necessarily teaching, although I heard this particular hospital, I heard some doctors are refusing to care for Jewish patients, which I'm told violates the first principle. Apparently the doctor's principle is not just the Hippocratic Oath, but it's the body in front of you, right? You treat the body in front of you. So that is obviously not applying to Jews at this university, but she's an academic. She's off campus. She's using social media. You know, she's got tenure. You might feel outraged by it, but do you think that she has the First Amendment right to speak?
I think you're very wise to raise this distinct issue of her professional obligations as a doctor. I can't speak to that, but speaking specifically and only about her academic status, under the American Association of University Professors, AAUP, free speech principles that go back to 1915, so-called extramural speech, which occurs not in your role as a professor, not in your role in the classroom, not in your role in academic research, but in your capacity as a citizen. You don't give up your free speech rights to opine, to mouth hateful and hated opinions in your private citizen capacity unless your statement demonstrably shows that you are unfit for carrying out your academic responsibilities.
But you're scaring Jewish
and the
patients.
AAUP standards go on to say that extramural statements are almost never going to satisfy that standard. This is what's being used against Amy Wax at the University of Pennsylvania. Exactly the same thing. There's been not one allegation of actual discrimination against a student in a class or any such statement
This is the professor
in a
at the law
class
school
at-
who's made some comments. I just want to make them sure. She's made some very, what is considered incendiary comments. She said, I've never had a black student, African-American student, that's graduated in the top half of my classes. In my classes, they just seem to be always in the bottom of the class. So, you know, I'm sure your mouths are open. She says a number of things. She's now on some kind of leave, right? But there's been...
You know, so, I mean, this is an important point. The professor's right to speak extramurally does not have any effect on my right to expose what she said.
Right.
Or to put a review on whatever the medical equivalent of Yelp is that isn't a particularly favorable review, or to say, patients beware, you know, should she see a Star of David, this is what she happens to think. I mean, I was somewhat amused because I was at a doctor's office not long ago being examined, and he was busy telling me, oh, I love your columns. I was like, well, I'm glad you like them, because the alternative could be hair-raising.
Andres, can you turn that off? We know it's 6 o'clock.
So
we're going to be done soon.
But this is important, and this gets back to, I think, the central principle here, which is that generally speaking, the right response to terrible speech is more and better speech, right? That's why I take such a dim view of hate speech laws, whether they're in Canada or in Europe. Driving speech underground doesn't make the thought or the agenda go away. It just martyrizes speech that is foul and ought to be exposed, which is why I think Brandeis is right.
Thanks, Andres. And Bret knows I totally disagree with that. But I would.
No, that was the 3-to-1 debate.
That was where I was getting hammered by the three of them. I think that's just nuts. But by the way, I think it's nuts that neo-Nazis get to march on Holocaust survivors. I think it's nuts that you could break up the military funeral of someone who died in Afghanistan because you don't like gays serving in the military. I think the Europeans are right about this, but she's going to get very upset any second. So let me just, because we got to finish this up quickly. I want to raise one question and then one question for the audience. One question goes to this idea about Charlottesville, the Jews will not replace us. They were represented by your crew, the ACLU, just like the ACLU represented the neo-Nazis in the 1977 Skokie case. After that happened in Charlottesville, the outcome of that, 200 lawyers for the ACLU wrote a letter to the executive director and said, what the hell are we doing? Why did we go in front of the judge in Charlottesville to get these clowns an opportunity to march under the First Amendment? We should be involved in other stuff. We shouldn't be involved here. And what I want to ask is, I think that Nadine knows this is your former organization, and if you watch Floyd, the movie about Floyd, Speaking Freely, the new American Masters, you kind of see it at the end. There's a dark spot there. And what's the dark spot? It's that the progressive left that was always libertarian in favor of civil liberties is now focused on racial inequities and social justice. And so they've run away from this, and that's another reason why the culture has changed. The law isn't being protected enough by the people that should be doing the protecting, because those people, your former group, are saying, yeah, but I'm really a progressive, and in order to be a progressive, I have to be in for racial justice and social activism and not free speech. And I don't like Nazis, and I don't like the people of Charlottesville. That was my last question. Do we have any response to the dissipation of that progressive agenda that now is fixated on a woke protocols and not free speech?
Well, as you so well underscored by pointing out what many people don't know, that the ACLU did successfully represent the Unite the Right demonstrators in Charlottesville. And by the way, we won in court because there was not one iota of evidence at that point that there were even any plans for violence. The chief of police testified that they had been monitoring the situation and there would be no violence, and if there were violence, it would be completely under control. We know tragically that was not the case. The only reason that was given for denying the permit at the last minute was disagreement with the viewpoint, which the Supreme Court has said violates the bedrock principle of First Amendment. Government may not pick and choose who gets to speak based on whether the viewpoint is popular or not.
Just quickly, there are exceptions, time, place, and manner restrictions. The city of Charlottesville said, you know what, we really don't want you here. This part of the campus is going to be a volcano. We're going to put you over there. And the ACLU successfully said, no, the city can't do that. They can't marginalize your speech by putting you somewhere else.
I mean, look, the Illinois case of Nazis marching, they were deliberately marching in a Jewish area.
Well, not only that, Floyd, people didn't know. For some reason, Skokie in the 70s had the largest per capita percentage of Holocaust survivors, not Brooklyn, Skokie. And that's why the Nazis were there.
Right, and that's why it was brave, and the ACLU deserves credit.
And they were all Jewish
for
lawyers.
representing them, of course.
Question from the audience, we'll say goodnight. Given that both the left and the right engage in limiting speech and cancel culture, what gives you hope that this can change in the future, and how do you see that change coming? This is from the live stream. This is from someone named Jay. Jay High? I think it's Jay, or Jay High.
Well, there has been so much criticism of cancel culture, and one of the things that, and we've seen examples where it affects people who have progressive views, the Colin Kaepernick situation, as well as people who have conservative views. But what I find really encouraging is surveys show that it's the youngest generation, those that are now in high school and just entering college, who have the most negative view toward cancel culture, because they've grown up with it, they've suffered from it, they've seen their friends be exposed to it and punished by it.
Wait till you see the reaction of the youngest generation to yesterday's vote in the House, unanimous vote, which ought to make us nervous right away when the House is unanimous, to ban TikTok.
Yep. Right.
I mean,
they're
that's going to be
a
very big,
they're going to take that
really big case if that happens.
Look, I mean, the ultimate guarantee against cancellation is that it's still a free country, and you can still go west and light out for the country, to quote Huck. And you know, if I say something that ends up getting me fired, I'm fine, because I'm going to go and do something else. And there's going to be a market, I think, for people who think in a contrary direction and swim against currents. That's always been the nature of this country. So I've seen people get canceled and come back much stronger, much stronger. We know some of them on this stage. And that's ultimately, the fact is that America has great problems, but it has profound sources of regeneration and renewal, all of which I would argue are ultimately founded in the freedoms of the First Amendment.
Thank you. And in the spirit of the resources of renewal, 4 years later, something that was shut down because of a pandemic got revived, and the four of us, four friends, got a chance to do this with a far more interesting palette of discussions of things that have just happened recently. So I want to thank Bret and Floyd and Nadine, and thank you all for joining us. If you are Thank you. I want to make sure I get this. If you're taking CLE, here's your code. SLU 517. SLU 517. Good night, everyone. We'll see you at the next FOLCS 92Y event. Thank you. Good night.